Hello, heavy metallurgists. This is Kellen from Killing for Company. And today we've got a new death metal review for you. I'm going to be talking about the debut full length from Cleveland, Ohio, Noxis, with their release entitled Violence Inherent Within the System. So this is the debut full-length from Noxis, released here in the States on Rotted Live Records, and then it got European distribution, I believe, through Dawnbreed Records. Noxis is a relatively young death metal band. Had released an EP in 2020 entitled Expansive Hellish Black Mire that immediately grabbed my attention back when it was released 4 years ago, and I had been sort of anticipating a full-length coming out. Here we get it 4 years later. In the meantime, they've released splits, a compilation of the EP and demo material, along with a live album. But here we get an actual debut full-length, new material, and it is, for me, a welcome addition to 2024. Their sound initially stood out to me in the midst of a lot of young American death metal bands that are sort of pulling from 90s influences. But what made their sort of sound to be a little bit more different is it was based, yes, in a kind of Finnish atmosphere that's very popular now, but there's also this kind of Canadian technicality and a little bit of an American aggression, while not quite veering into brutal death metal. But we'll look at there in a second. What they do so well, along from the sort of a production value that sounded a little bit different to their peers, is sort of seamlessly integrate or weave these influences in a riffing style that seem very coherent and a less sort of like piecemeal additions to a sound. That strength here is further developed on Violence Inherent Within the System. So probably the first example we'll pull towards is in the second track here on Blasphemous Mausoleum for the Wicked. We get this cool little sort of technical, brutal flair that you would essentially pull from Cryptopsy's Blasphemy Made Flesh, and that sort of works its way into more of like a denser groove that you would find, let's say, on the latter portion of 90s Cannibal Corpse, say Tomb Mutilated up through Bloodthirst. You can see that they sort of weave those two things together. So this is a good time to talk about, and as I had previously mentioned, how we understand aggression relative to Noxis sort of riffing style and sound. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of aggression and what you could be perceived as, if you look at the bands that have influenced them, a brutal aspect to them. But we're talking about a time period in which, Blasphemy Made Flesh, Tomb of the Mutilated, this is relatively young years in the lifespan of brutal death metal. So while there isn't the kind of well-established vocabulary, sound, and assumption when you ascribe something like brutal death metal, the fact that it's sort of in its infancy here is important when we take into consideration how Noxis is using a very early sort of formation of brutal death metal to integrate into their sound, right? I'm not asking that you think about their sort of Flo Monier's incredibly supersonic drumming style or Lord Worm's vocal style. It's that sort of young, brutal death metal riffing that you found on Blasphemy Made Flesh and, the Cannibal Corpse albums that I mentioned, let's say up through Bloodthirst, that work its way into how we understand brutality and groove when we talk about the sound of Noxis. So when talking about early Cryptopsy and Cannibal Corpse in general as a band, we have to talk about the bass playing. It's a standout feature for those early Cryptopsy records. So much of the guitar sound was sort of mid-centric, and it allowed the bass playing to sort of wrap its tentacles around the rest of the band. Alex Webster is widely considered one of the better death metal bassists ever. And if anyone who knows Cannibal as a band knows that his role within their discography and in their playing style, their songwriting, is incredibly important. David Kirsch here for Noxis plays a similar role. His bass is all over this record. He is attacking and assaulting this bass like it stole something from him. He plays a fretless bass. It's just technically an incredibly proficient musician here, and an undeniable presence when listening to Violence Inherent Within the System. You get that from the very opening track, Skull Crushing Defilement. Kirsch sort of announces his presence with a very quick sort of bass line that begins the song, and then he sort of weaves his bass sort of inside and around all the guitar work happening on this track. Noxis isn't shy about incorporating and sort of interchanging ideas from some of the more eclectic and eccentric influences. On Torpid Consumption, they bring together Erosion of Sanity era Gorguts meets something like Demolic's Nespith. This track, on Erosion of Sanity, you find Gorguts becoming a little bit more technical than sort of their early Floridian influences. They're really pulling for not quite like a technical brutal sound, but venturing away from something straightforward, right? It's a great little middle piece within their discography. Well, Noxis takes that side of Gorguts and incorporates, this kind of clanging, bullish, off-kilter sound from Demolic, and they find ways to sort of bring them together, transitioning from sort of the Gorgut sound here all the way through something like Demolic. So while Gorguts and Demolic are guilty of plenty of interesting dynamic shifts within their catalog, on the track Tense and Forlorn, Noxis actually pulled from a different Finnish influence in Demigod. Seemingly to cite Slumber of Sullen Eyes, there's a part of this track where, for all the sort of technical and early brutal flair that they have to their sound, on this track there's a particular moment where the song seems to open up and more sort of atmospheric qualities and some of the ethereal elements that made Demigod appealing on their classic record start to integrate themselves into this Noxis sound as well. So for all its diversity, I would have to say the greatest left turn that happens throughout this entire record comes from the track Horns Echo over Khorazam. We'll go with Khorazam there. During an extended bridge, they get a clarinet and tuba solo. So there's some guest musicians, Glenn Kanisevich, and he plays the clarinet, and then there is a tuba doom duo. It's not a joke, that's actually listed as part of their description, from Infra Sub Contra that contribute here. It's a wild element, and I think it was the second single released from this record before it debuted. If you are not looking for that, it definitely will take your head off. So independent of any individual song here on the record, I kind of wanted to talk about the sound that Noxis have as a whole. Now, it first grabbed my attention back on Expanse of Hellish Black Mire, but it's here once again on Violence Inherent Within the System. And that's like this perceived amount of distance that you have from the musicians when you listen to a record. Noxis, every time I listen to them, I feel like I'm fighting for my life inside of a phone booth. And I don't think that's something that's happening necessarily in the mixing and mastering room. Like, it's not someone running onto a soundboard and altering something. But there's a perceived lack of distance going on with this mix. And I mean that in a complimentary way. I wouldn't say that their sound is necessarily too compressed. I think it actually has something to do more with like the performance of the individuals within the band than it does necessarily, just a mix and mastering studio element. The fact that it's been consistent here on these last two, the EP and the full length, leads me to believe that it is something that we can expect, or at least demand, hopefully, in future listens, because it's one of the more immediate aspects of their sound. The drumming performance here, I love the way, how powerful, right, the drums sound. It's not that they are necessarily triggered or, anything like that. They aren't elevated in the mix that feels disproportionate or unwelcome, at least to my ears. It just feels like it's sort of a matter of this drummer traded in his drumsticks for a riot baton, right? It's that they're performed at a level that just feels powerful, and it does not feel artificial. So I think it's one of the better aspects of this band and their sound, and it completely is separate from a lot of the cavernous superlatives that we often end up hearing when we are talking about younger death metal bands performing in this space. So I did want to spend a quick moment talking about the production on this record, at least in comparison to the EP that I first heard. On Hellish Black Mire, there's noticeably a different kind of guitar and bass tone, and I don't know if it's just a product of having 4 years that they had with Violence Inherent Within the System, but I end up missing here on their newest LP a little bit of the Death by Cinder Block kind of guitar bass tone that I initially heard on their EP. It's not to say that the production here is bad or anything like that. There's just a little bit more sort of insight and clarity going on, and I ended up sort of being okay with it in the end. It didn't bother me, but I can't help this sort of needling question as to what would this record sound like if it had the EP's guitar tone to it. It might be a small gripe, but one that I think deserves mention here for those who picked up Expansive Hellish Black Mire and are curious as to what this new record sounds like. So in the end, how do I feel about Violence Inherent Within the System? I think 4 years, it was worth the wait. It's a major success, and while I do have some reservations and criticisms regarding the guitar, bass, production values, wishing that they had captured the same kind of sound heard on Hellish Black Mire and brought it here to this new full length, it's a small complaint in comparison to a band who I think actually has a unique sort of riffing style, at least relative to their peers nowadays. They are 100% rooted in a 90s death metal sound, but what they avoid, and why this record is a success in my opinion, is they do not fall into the stale and barren set of influences and superlatives that have been endlessly mined over the past 15, 20 years by bands, hoping to recapture some hidden treasure buried in 90s death metal left unexplored. While those records are 100% classic and will always be influential, Noxis does not sound like 90% of their peers, and I think that is to their credit. It's not often enough that we get a young death metal band that you can say uniquely has their own set of influences or are crafting a riffing style that is pulled from, many of the bands that you and I know and love, but are merging or bringing them together in a way that is creating their own sort of sonic voice. So Noxis, to their credit, they've started to sort of weave their own world there, and this is their debut full length. Well worth the wait. Big recommendation. One of my favorite death metal records here in 2024. All right, that's all I got for you. Once again, thank you for watching Heavy Metallurgy. You can check up all of the album reviews that you can usually swing by every week. Different people will have them posted for you. You can see me over on the album club every Wednesday night. And that's all I got for you. Until then, thanks so much for watching. See you guys later.